Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. The other day I was thinking about doing a video on Marvel and their massive offloading of their comics and their trade paperbacks to discount chains. And I still might do a video on that, but I started thinking about it and my train of thought went like this. Well, maybe they just need some room in their warehouses, because that's the only reason I can think of why they would need to get rid of their books from a warehouse, because comics don't go bad, right? That was my thought. And then my thought after that was, wait a second. We're talking about current Marvel and DC books. They actually might go bad. And here's where my train of thought went. I already know that Marvel, and to some extent DC, and the rest of the smaller comic companies, a lot of them are not worth buying because of their storylines, and they're just so bad. But I'm thinking more about the print quality right now. And in my experience, and I'll go over that experience in a couple of minutes, but in my experience, these comics, especially Marvel, might actually go bad. And, DC has, again, shored up a little bit of its quality with its paper and its ink, because that's what a comic is made up of. It's made up of paper and ink. And I would say that there is a 50-50 chance that the Marvel comics, and to some extent DC and the rest of them, but especially Marvel comics right now, that you are buying might go bad. That is to say, at best, they might just become an unreadable mess and be worthless, and at worst, they might become toxic within your collection, and you will have to cull them out so they don't affect the rest of your collection physically. And I'm not talking about because it will be worth nothing. It will be worth nothing if this happens, but I'm saying it might physically damage the rest of your collection. Now, here's where I came up with this, because I have done research for a long time. I used to do research, and I spent a lot of time in archives. And an archives is basically a museum for documents. And these are really, really pampered documents. I mean, they're in sealed containers, in special boxes, in special sealed rooms or vaults, which are temperature controlled and moisture controlled and everything else. And if you want to even look at them, you have to put on special gloves and everything else. And you're not allowed to take pictures of them because of the light that needs to be on them and all this kinds of stuff. So these are really pampered documents. All right, more pampered than anybody that is keeping a comic collection right now. I can tell you right now, no matter how pampered you think your comic collection actually is, it doesn't matter if you have a special room for it and you keep it at a certain temperature, it's not as pampered as these documents in an archives is. And in an archives, usually the documents are separated into sections because they have to be treated a little bit differently according to different eras. Now, when most people hear that, they think, well, a different era would probably be some large happening in history, right? Because these are historical documents. No, it actually has to deal with the level of paper quality and the level of ink quality that usually the government in that local area was using at the time. And when they change from one print quality to another print quality, those documents have to be treated differently. And so the ones that have poor ink quality and poor paper quality, that is to say cheap paper and cheap ink, well, they're going to degrade much, much faster than other kinds of documents. And again, when you say that to normal people, they would think, well, the farther back you go in history, the cheaper that you would get paper and ink. And so the newer documents would last a lot longer, when actually quite the opposite is the case. The farther you go back in history, the better the print quality, the better the paper, the better the ink, and the longer these documents will last. I remember when computers started to actually appear in offices, and there was a big push to digitalize a lot of these archives, and at the very least a lot of the information that was on these archives, and they started from the ones that were the newest and moved backwards because the newest ones were of the lowest quality. and they were going to degrade faster than anything else. And when I mean degrade, it would be simply the ink interacting with the paper in such a way that you could no longer read them, and they would become useless, or at worst, they would become toxic to the rest of the collection for some reason, and they would have to be taken out of the collection. Now, this, I think, may be, again, I would say this is just supposition on my part, but from my experience, I would say there's a 50-50 chance that this may happen to your comics that you are buying today, especially your Marvel comics, because of the poor quality, the cheap quality of both the ink and the paper. And we know this. I mean, pick up a Marvel comic and read it. How many times do your fingers stick to it? How many times do you have black on your hands after you're done reading it? How many times are your fingerprints literally left on the pages after you read a Marvel comic? And again, DC has improved its quality slightly over the last little bit, but again, it's not the quality that was historically there, I don't think. So, if this were to happen, it would simply be, I'd say, at best, if this were to happen, your ink and your paper would interact with each other in a way where even if you have them in bags, even if you have them bagged and boarded in a comic box, in a special room that is actually, temperature controlled and everything else, they would just bleed together. Just interact with each other. The ink and the paper would interact with each other in a way that they would bleed together so that it would no longer be legible. And this would simply be a worthless comic, because you couldn't even read it. That's at best. And at worst, that it might actually become toxic. Again, if you've been around with comics for a while, you know that certain bags interact with the ink and the paper of your comic. I mean, back in the 90s where they put out those new bags, and then everybody learned that it was leaching the color out of your comics and everything else, right? I mean, this has happened to comics before. For different reasons, but it's happened to comics before. And so, if by chance your ink actually reacts with your bags to a point where they leach from one to the other, not from the paper and the ink into each other, but the ink into the actual bag, then that would actually leach into other bags of the same quality, of the same kind, which would be in your collection, and actually damage your collection. They would actually damage the other comics that are in bags in your collection. And in order to make sure that this didn't happen, you would have to call out all of these new comics and get rid of them. And again, this is supposition on my part, but from experience, and looking at the cheap quality of what is being used right now for paper and ink, I would say this is a 50-50 chance of this happening. Now, I can hear a couple of ideas being shouted out right now, like the fact that comics have always been low quality, and cheap paper and cheap ink, this has never happened before, why would it happen now? Well, again, the thing is that you got to look historically at the way comics were produced. I mean, even back in the 40s, I'm sure they probably used the cheapest paper and the cheapest ink that they could find in order to produce these comics. However, you have to realize, just like the documents that I was talking about, the further back you go in history, the better quality ink and paper was. So their cheapest quality back in the 40s of ink and paper would be probably mid-level quality today. It would be much better quality than what our cheap is today. Much, much better. And the thing is that they built upon those kinds of products. I mean, they used that cheap quality, which was better quality than what we have today for cheap, and they actually saw what worked and saw what didn't work and used it as part of their publishing. It was part of the game to understand how comics actually worked, that is to say, in the physical sense, how the ink would interact with the paper and make sure that you had at least a product that would stand up for a little bit of test of time, because comics were something that were passed around. I mean, they were something that were battered and thrown in the corner, and people just gave them to each other. That's one of the reasons why comics became read by everyone. They had to be battered around. They had to know these things. They had to know the quality. And so they built upon that history of paper and ink and knowing how it actually worked. And yes, they changed them over the years. And up until the 80s, I would say possibly the 90s, when they really started to change all of the paper quality and the ink quality, they built upon that history, one upon another upon another. It was a step process. But then the 90s came along, and you had all of these more, we'll say, high quality paper being used and high quality inks being used, and all of that happened. And then you had the industry trying to produce stuff that were more and more high quality, more and more, because that's how they were trying to rope people in. And then they realized that that wasn't going to work anymore, and they went back to cheap paper and cheap ink, which is what we have today. But that cheap paper and cheap ink is not built upon that history which came before. You don't have 40, 50 years of using this quality paper and this quality ink, or some variation thereof, to build upon, to actually know how it's going to interact. And let me tell you, when you use a new quality of something to try to produce new documents, it rarely ever goes well. I mean, even when you're using top quality stuff. I can remember back in the 90s where I had all these libraries, and they were thinking, well, we have CDs now. We have to get rid of all of these vinyl records because they're just taking up too much space. And look, CDs are plastic, so they're going to last forever, right? And they found out about after 10 years, no, those CDs degrade really fast. And those are top quality. And the vinyl actually degrades much slower. And then they said, okay, we'll change it from CDs to digital because that'll last much longer, right? No, digital gets corrupted very easily. And everybody just started cursing themselves because they got rid of all their vinyl, which still would have been fine. And that was them trying to do something, again, using top quality products and top quality preservation means. If you take the lowest quality possible and try to change it back, I say something is going to go wrong there. And we already know something is going wrong, but the fact that the ink comes off in our hands, this is beyond cheap. And the other objection that I can hear is people saying, well, that'll just make my comics worth more because I'll have the one that actually will last. Because if they're all going to go bad, mine is going to last because I pamper them. And again, if that's what you're thinking, no, you didn't listen to what I said at the first. Because if these things go bad, and again, I say 50-50 chance, then all of them will go bad. Every one of them. This will happen to every one of them. Even the ones that are bagged and boarded and kept in special rooms. I mean, they're just going to be worth nothing. Anyways, like I said, this is supposition on my part, but I wanted to talk about this because there are really only two things, I think, keeping the comic industry alive right now. And they are trade paperbacks and people paying a lot of money for comics, which would be comic collectors, mostly buying variant covers and everything else. And now we can see from the massive offloading of comics and graphic novels to discount chains that the graphic novel section of that which is keeping comics up is getting pretty shaky, if not crumbling right now. Can you imagine what would happen if collectors learned that these new comics that they are buying are going to be toxic to their collection, or at the very least going to be worthless in 5 years, 10 years, worthless to the point where you could no longer read them and no one will want them? I would say the entire comic industry would collapse. Even if they decided to say, well, we'll make sure that we'll put in new ink and new paper and it'll be much better. And if they do that, they're going to have to jack up the price. And I mean really jack up the price if they put it on superior quality again. But at the same time, even if they do that, who's to say that they're going to be right this time? They weren't right last time. They're not right now in putting this kind of paper and this kind of ink together. Who's to say that their next guess would be any better? Because again, they're not working upon that history, that print history. And again, if this were to happen, then comics would collapse in the medium that they are right now, in the way that they are produced right now. All right, so if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a message. Tell me whether or not you think that this train of thought actually has any merit. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.